Edward Sherman, a 55-year-old photographer and land developer from Camden, New Jersey, had spent several years running a photography studio on Central Avenue. However, in 1913 he shifted his focus to real estate development. He acquired a remote piece of land along Johns Pass Road, now known as 30th Avenue North, with the vision of creating a new suburb for St. Petersburg, which he named Wildwood Gardens. Aside from a single-story bungalow he built for himself and his wife, the land remained undeveloped. At the time, the property was considered out in the country, as the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. Sherman employed 11 black men to work on his property, one of whom was John Evans, until just days before the murder. Evans had recently arrived in St. Petersburg from Dunellen and had been working for Sherman as a chauffeur and handyman. However, on November 7th, 3 days before the murder, Sherman dismissed Evans for reasons that remain unknown. According to an acquaintance, Evans appeared to hold a grudge over his dismissal. On the night of his death, Edward Sherman went to bed around 8 p.m., sleeping in an alcove with low, narrow windows on either side and 2 large ones in the front. His wife, Mary Sherman, remained in the adjoining parlor, weaving Christmas baskets from grass and pine needles. Around 10 p.m., a shotgun blast shattered the night. Rushing to the bedroom, Mrs. Sherman found that the blast had destroyed her husband's skull. She later reported that a black man then pointed a gun at her, demanded money, and threatened to kill her. She handed over approximately $100, but a second black man allegedly dragged her outside, beat her with a pipe, and tore parts of her clothing. Though she did not explicitly state she was assaulted, newspaper accounts strongly implied it. The attackers fled, and Mrs. Sherman claimed she fainted. Upon awakening to the sight of her husband's corpse, she fainted again, only regaining consciousness around 3 a.m. She then stumbled to a neighbor's house, and word of the attack spread from home to home until reaching one with a telephone. Authorities were soon alerted, and news quickly circulated that 2 black men had assaulted the Shermans. Mrs. Sherman was taken to Augusta Memorial Hospital, where she was reported to be in critical condition. When she regained consciousness, she told police she believed she recognized John Evans's voice during the attack. Evans was immediately identified as the prime suspect and taken into custody. However, when presented to Mrs. Sherman for identification, she was unable to confirm him as her attacker, leading to his release. A second man, Ebenezer B. Tobin, was also accused of the crime and taken to the county jail in Clearwater, despite the arresting deputy's insistence that he had no involvement. To prevent mobs from storming the jail and seeking vigilante justice, authorities kept news of Tobin's arrest quiet. By morning, rumors spread rapidly through word of mouth and sensational newspaper headlines, fueling anxiety and outrage. The tension ignited a massive manhunt led by armed white citizens. Hundreds of black men were detained, interrogated, and in some cases, physically assaulted. Chaos gripped the city as crowds frantically searched for suspects, with some even scouring the woods north of town. In response to the unrest, the St. Petersburg Commission ordered all saloons to close, but Central Avenue remained packed until midnight as white residents speculated about the whereabouts of the attackers. Fear drove many black residents to flee. Some boarded trains, others walked along the Atlantic coastline tracks, and some escaped by boat. Meanwhile, outside Augusta Memorial Hospital, nearly 100 armed men gathered, determined to prevent any suspect from escaping before being presented to Mrs. Sherman for identification. On the morning of November 12th, armed posses raided black homes, arresting 6 men and taking them to jail. In one instance, a group fired 3 shots at a black man walking alone on 9th Street South. During a raid in Methodist Town, where John Evans had previously lived, searchers discovered a blood-stained shirt and shoes. Another resident claimed they belonged to Evans, though he later recanted the statement. However, the posse took it as enough evidence to hunt Evans down once again. Following his earlier release, Evans had found work for a black employer near 5th Avenue South and 22nd Street. Someone revealed his location to police, who then tipped off the mob. When the group found Evans, they nearly lynched him on the spot, but instead chose to extract a confession through torture. For hours, he endured brutal interrogation, but when no confession was forthcoming, the mob brought him back before Mary Sherman. Once again, she failed to identify him as her attacker or her husband's murderer. Despite this, Evans was returned to the city jail, where an enraged mob of 1,500 had gathered. The crowd, growing increasingly violent, threatened to kill jailer E.H. Nichols. They then tore down part of the jail sidewall, slipped a noose around Evans' neck, and dragged him into the street. At least half of the city's white population marched west down Central Avenue towards the black section of town, where Evans was ultimately killed. In the early morning hours, after the mob had dispersed, a policeman recovered what remained of Evans's body. Despite his death, much of the city remained in turmoil, with white vigilantes still searching for his supposed accomplices or sympathizers. Rumors even spread about plans to burn down the entire black community. While some black residents vowed to stand their ground and fight, many others fled in fear. In the following days, the exodus continued, with reports of 179 black women and children boarding an afternoon boat to Tampa in search of safety. Anthony Crawford was born around 1865, during the early years of the Reconstruction era. After the Civil War, his father acquired a modest piece of land along the Little River, about 7 miles west of Abbeville, where he and his son worked together to cultivate cotton. An ambitious and literate child, Anthony Crawford regularly walked 7 miles to attend school in Abbeville. Upon his father's passing, Crawford inherited the land and significantly expanded it through major purchases in 1883, 1888, 1899, and 1903. By the mid to late 1890s, he co-founded the Industrial Union of Abbeville County, an organization dedicated to advancing the material, moral, and intellectual well-being of black residents. He was also the father of 12 sons and 4 daughters. By 1916, Crawford's land holdings had grown to at least 427 acres, with some sources estimating it as much as 600 acres. Many of his children settled on neighboring plots, further expanding his family's presence in the area. With a net worth of approximately $20,000 to $25,000 in 1916 dollars, he was undoubtedly one of the wealthiest men in Abbeville County. Crawford was known for his unwavering refusal to accept disrespect from anyone. In one instance, when a preacher at his church criticized him during a sermon, Crawford immediately struck the man and dismissed him on the spot. His defiance extended to interactions with white individuals as well, once telling his children, "The day a white man hits me is the day I die." Following his death, New York investigative reporter Roy Nash spoke to prominent citizens of Abbeville, including Dr. Harrison, president of Farmers Bank. Harrison described Crawford as insolent towards whites and believed he got what he deserved. On October 21, 1916, Anthony Crawford brought 2 wagon loads of cotton and a load of seed into Abbeville, where he had a dispute over the price of cottonseed with W.D. Barksdale, a white store owner. After Crawford left the store, one of Barksdale's employees followed him outside and struck him on the head with an axe handle. Crawford called out for help, drawing the attention of Sheriff R.M. Burtz, who arrested him as an angry white mob began to gather. Crawford was briefly held in jail before being released later that day on a $15 bail. While he was arranging for bail, Barksdale and McKinney Can were organizing a mob, intending to whip Crawford to cure him if possible. Sheriff Burtz attempted to help Crawford escape through a side door, but the mob spotted him and gave chase. Seeking refuge in a nearby cotton mill, Crawford hid in the boiler room. McKinney Can followed him inside, but Crawford managed to knock him unconscious with a hammer. However, the mob soon overwhelmed him, stabbing and severely beating him. Despite efforts by mill workers to intervene, Sheriff Burtz arrested Crawford again, this time to prevent the mob from killing him on the spot. To appease Can's brothers, who demanded vengeance, Burtz promised not to remove Crawford from the town before knowing the extent of Can's injuries. While Can recovered quickly, Crawford was badly wounded and was treated by Dr. C.C. Gamble, the mayor of Abbeville, who predicted he would not survive. Fearing that Crawford might die before they could exact further violence, a mob of around 200 white men stormed the jail at 3 p.m., overpowering and disarming Sheriff Burtz. They dragged Crawford down 3 flights of stairs through a cheering crowd, brutally beating him with rocks and wagon boards while spitting on him. The mob then tied a rope around his neck and dragged him through the black section of town as a warning to others. Seizing a lumber wagon from a black driver, they transported Crawford to a nearby fairground, where they hanged his likely lifeless body from a tree. White men armed with rifles and shotguns then fired into his body, turning it into what was described as a bloody pulp. That evening, County Coroner F.W.R. Nance convened a jury to examine Crawford's remains. 2 members of the lynch mob, including Nance's own grandson, were knowingly included in the jury. The official verdict, Crawford had died at the hands of parties unknown. The violence did not end there. That night, the mob sought to expel Crawford's children and their families from Abbeville. A group of white businessmen, including Jack Perrin, J. Allen Smith, and J. S. Stark, worried about the economic consequences of such a move, convinced the mob to hold a meeting the following Monday to determine the fate of the Crawford family. On October 23, 1916, the white citizens of Abbeville, many of whom had participated in the lynching, voted to forcibly remove the Crawford family from South Carolina and seize their extensive land holdings. They also voted to close all black-owned businesses in Abbeville. The Crawfords requested time to leave, and they were granted until November 15th. By mid-November, they had fled, leaving behind their generational wealth and property. Years later, on November 16, 1928, Crawford's 427-acre property along the Little River, valued at approximately $20,000, was auctioned off. It was purchased by Colonel T.G. White for just $610. In Robinson, Texas, Lucy Fryer was murdered in her home on May 8, 1916. Her body was discovered brutally beaten and sprawled across the doorway of the farm seed shed with signs of sexual assault. Authorities determined she was killed with a blunt instrument. Lucy and her husband George, English immigrants, were respected members of the rural community where they ran a farm. The news of her death quickly reached McLennan County Sheriff Samuel Fleming, who launched an investigation, enlisting law enforcement, local men, and a doctor. The doctor confirmed that Fryer died from blunt force trauma to the head. Suspicion fell on Jesse Washington, a 17-year-old black youth who had worked on the Fryer farm for 5 months. A local man claimed to have seen Washington near the Fryer house just before the body was found. That night, sheriff deputies visited Washington's home, where they found him wearing blood-stained overalls. Washington claimed the stains were from a nosebleed. He, along with his brother William and their parents, were taken to Waco for questioning. Washington's family was released, but he was held for further interrogation, without legal representation. Though he denied involvement, his statements were inconsistent. Rumors circulated about a previous altercation between Washington and another man days before the murder. On May 9th, to prevent possible vigilante retaliation, Sheriff Fleming took Washington to Hill County. There, with Sheriff Fred Long, Washington admitted to killing Fryer after an argument about her mules. He described the murder weapon and its location, which led to the discovery of a bloody hammer. Washington was taken to Dallas, where he dictated and signed a confession detailing the assault and murder of Fryer. The confession was published the next day in Waco newspapers, which sensationalized the story. However, the doctor who examined Fryer's body found no evidence of sexual assault, contradicting the claims in the press. A lynch mob formed in Waco that night, but it disbanded after failing to locate Washington in jail. Meanwhile, a small private funeral for Lucy Fryer was held. On May 11th, a grand jury indicted Washington, and his trial was set for May 15th. A Waco newspaper urged the public to allow the justice system to decide Washington's fate. Sheriff Fleming visited Robinson on May 13th, calling for calm, and his address was well received. Washington was assigned inexperienced lawyers who prepared no defense, and he remained calm in the days leading up to his trial. On the morning of May 15th, the Waco courthouse was packed in anticipation of Jesse Washington's trial, with the crowd so large that it nearly prevented some jurors from entering. Over 2,000 spectators gathered, mostly white, with a few quiet members of Waco's black community in attendance. As Washington was led into the courtroom, an audience member pointed a gun at him, but was quickly subdued. The trial began with Judge Richard Irby Monroe attempting to maintain order and instructing the crowd to remain silent. Jury selection proceeded swiftly, with the defense raising no objections to the prosecution's choices. When asked for a plea, Washington mumbled a response, which the court interpreted as a guilty plea. The prosecution laid out the charges, and witnesses, including law enforcement officers and the doctor who had examined Lucy Fryer's body, testified. The doctor confirmed Fryer's cause of death, but did not mention sexual assault. After the prosecution rested, Washington's defense attorney asked him if he had committed the crime. Washington responded, "That's what I'd done," and quietly apologized. The lead prosecutor declared that the trial had been fair, prompting applause from the crowd. The jury deliberated for only 4 minutes before returning a guilty verdict and sentencing Washington to death. The trial lasted just about an hour. As court officers moved to escort Washington out of the courtroom, the crowd surged forward, overpowering them. Spectators dragged Washington outside, where he initially resisted, biting one man, but was soon beaten. A chain was placed around his neck, and he was pulled towards City Hall by the mob. On the way, he was stripped, stabbed, and beaten with blunt objects. At City Hall, a bonfire had been prepared, and Washington, bloody and semi-conscious, was doused with oil, hanged from a tree by a chain, and lowered to the ground. Members of the crowd mutilated his body, cutting off his fingers, toes, and genitals. The fire was then lit, and Washington was repeatedly raised and lowered into the flames, where he burned to death. Some scholars suggest the executioners tried to prolong his suffering. Washington tried to climb the chain, but was unable to without his fingers. The fire continued for 2 hours, after which bystanders collected gruesome souvenirs, including parts of Washington's body and links from the chain. One person even took part of his genitals, and a group of children removed his teeth to sell them. By the time the fire was extinguished, Washington's arms and legs had been burned off, and his head and torso were charred. His body was removed from the tree and dragged behind a horse through the town. His remains were taken to Robinson, where they were publicly displayed until the constable intervened and buried them later that day.